Good evening, everybody. I want to thank you all so much for coming out. Welcome. My name is David Shayevitz, and I'm a professor of Jewish history here at Northwestern and director of the Crown Family Center for Jewish and Israel Studies. I can't tell you what a pleasure it is to welcome all of you here tonight. It would be a pleasure under any circumstances, but tonight is our first fully in-person event that we've had since the winter of 2020, and it feels like really a remarkable and very much long-awaited chance for all of us to gather together and learn and study and discuss together. So I'm really, really thrilled to have you all here. Before we kick off our latest installment of the Renée and Lecture Crown speaker series, allow me to say just a couple of words about the Crown Family Center and to acknowledge some of the people who've made tonight's event possible. The Crown Family Center for Jewish and Israel Studies, as I know many of you know, is an academic hub for undergraduate and graduate education, innovative faculty and student research, and accessible and engaging public programming. Our students, affiliated faculty members, and visiting professors and postdoctoral fellows study, teach, and research Jewish history, Jewish philosophy and thought, Hebrew and Yiddish language and literature, Holocaust studies, and the history, politics, and culture of the State of Israel. The Crown Family Center is comprised of over a dozen affiliated full-time faculty members, a robust group of visiting scholars and postdoctoral fellows, an undergraduate major, 2 undergraduate minors, an interdisciplinary graduate cluster for PhD students, and dozens of annual courses that enroll hundreds of students. Part of what makes the Crown Center unique among the university's many departments, programs, and centers is our dedication to communal engagement and to building bridges between the university and the wider public. And tonight's event is a great example of that, and just one of several upcoming programs that aim to strengthen this link. And so I'd urge all of you to please sign up for our mailing list, check out our website, our social media presence on Facebook. You can find out more information about our upcoming programming, some of it online, some of it in person, some of it hybrid. There's lots of other wonderful opportunities to study together. Let me quickly just say a word of thanks on the topic of the Crown Family Center to 2 members of our administrative team, Nancy Gelman and Katie Genio, each of whom worked really tirelessly to make tonight's event possible, and we're so grateful to them for that. A word of background about this particular lecture series. Nearly a decade ago, when friends of Lester and Renée Crown decided they wanted to give a gift to the university in recognition of the Crown's leadership and generosity, they decided not to donate a plaque or a statue or a fountain or any of the normal things that philanthropists will sometimes donate to universities, but instead to reinvest in Jewish culture and scholarship by sponsoring this lecture series. And over the past decade, the series has brought to campus a wide array of musicians, artists, authors, to bring the best of Jewish culture to the Northwestern campus and to use the platform of the university to disseminate Jewish learning to the broader public community. And so it's a real wonderful series, one that we're very proud of, and I can't think of a better person to re-inaugurate the in-person Crown Speaker Series than our speaker and an interlocutor tonight, Joshua Cohen. Joshua Cohen, many of you here have read his books, and probably he requires no introduction, but it's not going to stop me from giving a brief introduction. He's the author most recently of The Netanyahus, an account of a minor and ultimately even negligible episode in the history of a very famous family, and hopefully we'll be discussing all the different facets of that subhead. He is an award-winning author, a very prolific author, and somebody who came into, I'd say, or re-entered public consciousness for this particular novel in the summer of 2021, when in the midst of COVID, in the midst of a seemingly never-ending series of Israeli elections, with the latest flare-up of violence between Israel and Gaza, this novel was released, which seemed really prescient in terms of the series of issues that it addressed, the themes and topics that it took on: American Jewish identity, Israeli identity, the relationship between Israel and America, the nature of anti-Semitism, so on and so forth. All of it put together in really a insightful, learned, sometimes challenging, extensively researched and fiercely intellectual book that also happens to be quite hilarious. And anybody who's read the book, we're going to try and avoid some of the biggest spoilers, but it really packages the immense amount of learning that went into it in an accessible and extremely entertaining and really fun way. And so it's a wonderful opportunity for all of us tonight to speak with Joshua about this particular book, about the other publications he's released over the course of his career, which include Wit's Book of Numbers, The Netanyahus, a number of other novels and works of nonfiction. He's the winner of the 2021 National Jewish Book Award. He's the winner of the 2013 Matanel Prize for Jewish Writers. In 2017, he was named one of Granta's best young American novelists. The list goes on, but in the interest of time, I'm not going to extend it. And our format for the conversation tonight with him is going to be as follows. Joshua is going to be presenting brief opening remarks. After that, we're going to segue to some moderated conversation between myself and my colleague Claire Soufrin. Claire is the Assistant Director of the Crown Family Center and also a scholar of modern Jewish thought and modern American Jewish literature. And after we've had a chance to discuss the novel and his career with Joshua, we're going to move to audience Q&A. So please keep track of your questions, and we'll have a chance for all of us to engage in some conversation together. Without further ado, it's a real honor and privilege to introduce Joshua Cohen.
Hello, can everyone hear me? I'm here to sell Dell computers. Hi, thank you for coming. I was intimidated when I was told this was a lecture series. And it's always my problem that I take things literally. So I was like, well, what is a lecture? I need to give a lecture. Okay. So I wanted to try this out with you. This is a little part of it's short. Lecture is maybe too big of a word for it. It's short. I wanted to try out a little part of a nonfiction book that I'm writing, that I've written, that I hope will come out soon. And it was written during the, I don't know if you've been following what's happened over the past 2.5 years, but it's been written during that. And I feel like it's fitting for the first kind of in-person event here to maybe read this and see how it goes. It's about prophecy and internal monologue, internal voices, and drinking too much, and some other things. It's called Notes from the Cave. And it's dated at the top, I can't even believe that it's dated at the top, summer 2020. So, yeah. A few nights ago, I was visited by an email. Back before the world gasped, my brother, the doctor, hardly ever wrote me anything beyond a Shabbos dinner, yes, no. And yet here he was, in the breathless thick of it, attaching a file of 7,241 words. I'd thought that he was far out in the boroughs, intubating the sick or putting them through dialysis, and he was, but somehow he'd also found the time and adrenalized energy to put more language down on the screen than I, the ostensible writer, had managed to eke out in weeks, even months. The instructions that came at the top of the email explained or implied how this was possible. This email, my brother wanted me to know, wasn't for me. It was only for me to hold on to. And in the event of his death, I was to pass it along to his wife and children, my niece and nephew, from whom he'd been separated since he'd started treating patients infected with the novel coronavirus. His family was upstate at his wife's mother's condo, and he was at one or another of the hospitals in the Mount Sinai system. And this email was on my computer, and all that was in my head was the hope of levity. Do you want me to forward it to your kids or print the thing out? I thought. And then I remembered that his kids didn't have email yet, and only one of them could read. At the time, Again, summer 2020. More than 24 medical workers had already died of the virus in the United States, most of them in New York City, and hundreds had died around the world, including, or beginning with, Dr. Li Wenliang, the Chinese ophthalmologist who tried to bring the virus to wider attention and was persecuted by his government for the effort. My brother, a surgeon who cuts cancer for a living, is normally unflappable, but here he was, flapping, giving an account of his life for children so young that he was afraid that they would barely remember him. I'd never known him to be afraid of anything, or for that matter, to seek my counsel. After giving me my instructions, he signed off by saying that if I had any edits, I should let him know. I had no edits. I simply archived the email, which will outlive us both, which will outlive his wife, and even his children's children's children on clouds. When Albert Einstein died in 1955, his brain was removed during an unsanctioned autopsy at a hospital in Princeton. Later, at the University of Pennsylvania, a pathologist named Thomas Stoltz Harvey sliced it up for research purposes, but kept some of the slivers for himself. In 1988, Harvey, who'd since been stripped of his medical license, moved to Lawrence, home of the University of Kansas, where he presented one of the slivers to local author William S. Burroughs, after whose death in 1997, it passed into the possession of, I'm going to stop now because I don't want to get anyone in trouble. Let's just say that when I was in Lawrence, teaching at KU, this was a thing that still happened. A hazing that was also an homage. You scooped the bit of Einstein's brain out of the jar. You shook off the excess formaldehyde, blotted it. Then you put some salt in the crook of your thumb and licked it, after which you took down a shot of cheap room temperature tequila and sucked on the bit of brain until your mouth went numb, until the formaldehyde paralyzed your lips and tongue and you couldn't be understood. You couldn't even feel yourself trying to make language. This quarantine has brought me back to Burroughs, who claimed to believe, which means he didn't believe, but he wanted to believe, that language was a virus. Though it's difficult to puzzle out the exact pathology, because exactness was not Burroughs' practice, a summary might go like this. Language is a virus that crossed the species barrier from an extraterrestrial civilization. This virus infected prehistoric humanity and altered its throats, with the result that an infected person could now form sounds representing states that were previously interior, like thoughts or feelings. By exteriorizing and airing these states, in other words, by performing the act that we call speech, primitive people were actually infecting others, colonizing individual minds with foreign bodies that were contagious and self-replicating. The people who spoke the most, or who spoke the loudest, were the most dangerous spreaders of this fluency flu. And aware of this fact, or just aware of what viral culture would regard as their influence, they exploited it in pursuit of social control, broadcasting pandemics of mass ideas and mass emotions. These spreaders could make the vulnerable think what they thought and feel what they felt about anything. They could induce them to spew fake news as if it were real and to use alien verbiage as if it were native. They could even convince them that this virus wasn't literal, but a metaphor. Meanwhile, the virus kept mutating, so that what manifested in its first season as a mouth and ear disease returned in subsequent seasons as an eye and hand disease, with language becoming writing that left its scars in glyphs and grams on cave walls, papyri, parchment, paper, screens. Burroughs' virality theory wasn't just a media critique or a condemnation of the technologies, governments, and businesses that infect populations with language at scale. It was also and ultimately a condemnation of himself, or of theorizing and writing in general. The primary concern of his writing was that writing couldn't be done without damaging health. To express oneself in words was to infect one's readers and exert one's power. He, better than anyone, understood that a diagnosis itself could be a disease. To explain the language virus in language was to spread it. To his mind, to his language-ridden mind, the virality of language inhered in its drive to define and express a reality and replicate it endlessly. This reality would replace individuality cell by cell, or perception by perception, until humanity itself would be replaced, propagated into a new composite organism he called the audience. According to Burroughs, the only way to fight this determinative process was to surrender to the operations of chance and put his drafts through the cut-up method, a venerable surrealist technique by which scissors and knives and razor blades are used to excise paragraphs, resect sentences, and chop up their syntax and grammar, the veins of semantic transmission. Though he acknowledged that the subversion of literature was bound to be nothing against mass-mediated virulence, Burroughs came to regard his best-natured attempts as those slight doses of a disease that could serve as an inoculation. Susan Sontag put Burroughs' virality theory to the test with her censuring of illness metaphors, and the results are in negative. It's a metaphor. To Sontag, the very concept of illness was a rhetorical fallacy. To use the word illness was to create the ill, and to impose a false distinction between the ill and the healthy. Further, to refer to mass media bias, for example, or to some other historically oppressive and vile societal phenomenon as diseased, was to imply that disease itself was oppressive and vile, and that to suffer from disease was somehow deviant. By redefining disease from a shameful aberration to a natural condition, to nature's condition, by turning death, a thing, into dying, a process, Sontag hoped to restore to the sick the dignity of normalcy, to make from words a world in which sickness was not the end of life, but a part of life, a part that's been with each of us in waves since our birth. Sontag had a personal stake in opposing such metaphorical malignancy. Her first book on the subject, Illness as Metaphor, 1978, came out of her own treatment for cancer, and her second book, AIDS and Its Metaphors of 1989, came at the apex of the tidal epidemic, which ravaged so many of her friends. This new virus, COVID-19, a name that combines all the banality of an acronym, coronavirus disease, with all the anonymity of a number, 2019, requires a different rhetoric. The concatenated speed and breadth of its spread have rendered it literally incomparable. What is this virus like? And what is like this virus? A virus that affects indiscriminately, both symptomatically and asymptomatically, can represent nothing. It can be no symbol and bring no stigma, given that it might ultimately be inside all of us, even more pervasively than, say, the diseases of hunger, poverty, and racism. Whenever an incurable disease mounts a body count, there's a corresponding linguistic crisis that can be expressed in these Burroughsian versus Sontagian terms. Is language a metaphoric virus or a metaphoric antibody? Is language the proliferation of falsity or the protection against it? Or can it be both? And what if its function is conscious? If the dead could speak, they might tell us. Quote, "A theory is a metaphor between a model and data." That's what Julian Jaynes wrote in The Origin of Consciousness and the Breakdown of the Bicameral Mind in 1976. His elucidation of bicameralism, or the theory of the two chambers of the pre-conscious or pre-psychological brain. Here is another insufficient summary. Jaynes proposed that in the earliest human brains, cognitive function was divided, or lateralized. One part of the brain spoke, and the other part of the brain listened. Specifically, in his theory, the right hemisphere of the brain transmitted speech to the left, which experienced this speech as what Jaynes calls a hallucination, a visitation from a voice without a source, without a name, or a face, or a body. Because primitive humans who were merely talking to themselves, weren't yet conscious of having selves. They required a metaphor for the voices they were hearing. And so they invented the gods, along with the angels and demons and so on, all of whom or which predated consciousness or played the role of consciousness in antiquity. In the bicameral mind, and this is a quote, volition, planning, and initiative is organized with no consciousness whatsoever. And then it's told to the individual in his familiar language. The individual obeyed these hallucinated voices because he could not see what to do by himself. And elsewhere, Janes writes, quote, "The gods are organizations of the central nervous system and can be regarded as personae in the sense of poignant consistencies through time. The gods are what we would now call hallucinations." He writes elsewhere, quote, "At one time, human nature was split in two, an executive part called a god, and a follower part called a man. Neither part was conscious. Man would have to wait for his bicameral voice, which with the stored up, admonitory wisdom of his life, would tell him non-consciously what to do." But what precipitated these hallucinated voices? Or to put it another way, under what conditions would the executive or God part of an ancient human brain issue orders? Jane's answer to this question is simple: stress. He writes, "During the eras of the bicameral mind, we may suppose that the stress threshold for hallucinations was much, much lower than in either normal people or schizophrenics today. The only stress necessary was that which occurs when a change in behavior is necessary because of some novelty in a situation. Anything that could not be dealt with on the basis of habit, any conflict between work and fatigue, between attack and flight, any choice between whom to obey and what to do, anything that required any decision at all, was sufficient to cause an auditory hallucination." 2,000 or so years before Jesus Christ, a human might not have required a god to tell them which cave was their home cave. But if that human found themselves far from their home cave, and having to choose a route that would bring them back, they might have experienced such stress that a god had to speak up and decide for them. The next time this human would find themselves in the same situation, however, faced with the same choice of route, the memory of the previous decision would be conscious. They would remember, they would know, whether the route they'd taken previously had been successful. The knowledge of which route to take would have attained to the status of home cave knowledge. It would have become conscious knowledge, and in this manner, consciousness evolved out of increased encounters with novel conditions. Fundamental to the evolution of the Janesian consciousness was an improvement in the ability of humans to recognize the damage caused by their default submission to commands that resulted in unsuccessful outcomes, which in turn bred a growing willingness to interrogate and even resist not just those, but all inner voices. 2,000 or so years after Jesus Christ, we're receiving different commands from sources with names and faces and bodies that our consciousness must judge. When we leave our home caves, should we wear a mask? When we touch our cave's doorknobs, should we wear gloves? And what about visiting our friends' caves? Which friends and how to get there? In James's language, these are our stressors. My friend, who invited me over to their cave today, has no symptoms of the virus. But also, they have not been tested, or the tests they took were conflicting, or inconclusive, or they were the wrong tests. Still, they have stayed inside their cave for weeks, for months, leaving only to go food shopping. But they wore a mask and gloves in the store, and they disinfected all their food. But they didn't disinfect their bags. Or they threw out their bags and threw their clothes in the laundry and removed their mask before their gloves or their gloves before their mask and used soap or sanitizer to wash their hands, but they used the wrong brand of soap or the wrong brand of sanitizer, and then they took off their shoes, their feet touched the mat where their shoes were, soaking up the virus. While I think this, my friend is getting impatient. They don't want me to come to their cave anymore. They want to invite someone else, someone less scared or just less indecisive, or someone who has a car and doesn't have to take the trains or buses. Are you okay with me taking a taxi? If you're not okay, can you just pick me up and bring me back? Or should I just move in with you? And while we're at it, does having a certain blood type make me immune? And why does SARS-CoV-2, as it's sometimes called, unlike SARS-CoV-1, attack the whole immune system? What is a T cell? Is a protein a gene? And where or when or who is a thymus? I wish a God would swoop in and issue orders, telling me what's correct, what's incorrect, telling me what to do. Thou shalt visit the cave of thy friend. Thou shalt not. Thou may, but only in groups of 4 or fewer. Unfortunately, however, the only gods who arrive at my cave door lately, besides the delivery folks, are experts. Some of them well-meaning and some of them not, but all of them bearing facts that I don't remember ordering. Facts that are ambiguous when they're not contradictory, or vice versa, and subject to change. This is what Julian Jaynes wrote on prophecy, quote, "The speech of possessed prophets is not a hallucination proper, not something heard by a conscious, semi-conscious, or even non-conscious man, as in the bicameral mind proper. Instead, it is articulated externally and heard by others. It occurs only in normally conscious men and is coincident with a loss of that consciousness. What justification then do we have for saying that the two phenomena, the hallucination of the bicameral mind and the speech of the possessed, are related? Ask and it shall be given. I do not have a truly robust answer," Jaynes writes. This is how a late 20th century psychological seeker, who was still more academic than countercultural, disavows with wit his own status as a prophet. Take for a moment Jaynes's word, possession. Pop it in your mouth, chew it, 3 bites. Possession, swallow it. This is how prophecy once happened. Yeshayahu's mouth, like Moshe's mouth, was burnt by hot coal from an altar. God forced Yechezkel to eat a scroll and reached out a finger to move the lips of Yirmiyahu. A prophet is someone overtaken, usurped, vesselized, spoken through. A prophet is a human too conscious to be unaware of being possessed, and yet too unconscious to regard their possessor as anything less than a divinity. A prophet's introductory utterance, "I am telling you that God speaks through me in the voice you're hearing," is traditionally followed by an exhortation delivered not in the prophet's first-person singular presence or God's third-person authorial absence, but in this strange binding of the two, in the second-person plural, in the imperative. The you, without exception, the you that by including even the speaker asserts its mystery. This is the pronoun I've been hoping to hear while talking to myself in my quarantine. But instead, all I hear is, we're all in this together. After reading your email, my brother, I went to sleep, which is the brother of death, and I had a dream. People in masks and gloves were waiting in an endless line to enter heaven, a pearly gated facility that wasn't equipped to handle so many of them showing up all at once. It was chaos. People were crying, having fits. Inside, angels wearing scrubs over their wings were rushing around taking temperatures and trying to find empty beds. And every once in a while, in utter frustration, they stuck their haloed heads out the window and yelled down in their non-language at the round, turning earth, "Stay home, stay safe, stop the spread, flatten the curve." That's that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Joshua. Can people hear me okay? Okay, fantastic. So I'm going to start by asking you about a little bit more about your own experience over the last 2 years, during which time, from what I understand, you wrote the book in question. Is that right? And I wonder if you can take us from the reflections that you just shared and the sort of ambiguous or contested status of language as a coping mechanism, as a symptom, in all the different ways that you were pointing to, and then the way that it comes to fruition in this book, which in its own way is about the power of language, maybe in from a lot of different vantage points. So I wonder if you can just sort of connect some of those dots for us, or share any thinking about, the interplay between those two different pieces.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, I don't know. I mean, on one hand, the flippant answer is also kind of the true answer, which is that, looking back on it, I think it was just such despair and sadness and just emptiness in New York, really, where, 70,000 people died and 1 million people left the city, that I did the two dumbest things that I could think of, or the two things that I would never do, which is, one, write a historical novel, and two, write a campus novel. And then write a historical campus novel together. I mean, if you had told me before COVID that that's what I was going to do, I would say, oh man, you've really lost your mind. Okay, but I think what maybe connected it was really the sense of trying to ventriloquize the past in a way. I was thinking about language. I was thinking about what happens when, your only engagement with the world is through reading. That really was mine. I mean, living alone, and it was the largest, in general, I read more than I talk to people, but this was an exaggeration in the last few years. And I was thinking also about how the past can very much become the present in the absence of any alternative or any viable life. And I found myself sort of asking, or giving myself the permission maybe to say, oh, I could write a 1950s, 1960s a book from the point of American Jewish assimilation. I could write it now and sort of subject it to the politics of now. And I don't think that I would have listened to that nagging voice from the past unless I had this kind of tragic moment to slow down.
So, so much what you just said reminds me of a number of scenes in the book itself, in the Netanyahus, where the protagonist, or one of the protagonists, Reuben Blum, is sitting up all night poring over this file of his potential colleague, thinking many of these same kinds of questions. And so maybe it would be worth, I know that some people in the crowd have read the book. It's possible some people haven't. So just to maybe set the stage, this is a novel, and you should step in, of course, and correct me, that sort of pits two different characters, or puts them into dialogue with one another. Reuben Blum. Okay. Was that my bicameral mind, or did somebody? Okay.
You have to obey.
Reuben Blum, who is this assimilated or wannabe assimilated American Jew in this small college town in upstate New York, a historian, but not a Jewish historian who is a Jew, but not somebody who studies the Jewish past, and then this visiting Israeli scholar who is a real historical protagonist. So sort of on the topic of a historical novel, maybe you can tell us just a little bit about Ben-Zion Netanyahu, maybe the third most famous Netanyahu to most people, behind his sons Bibi and Yoni, but somebody who really comes to life in this book. And I wonder if you can just tell us a little bit about the choice of using him as a character.
I mean, he's my number one. I don't know. The book is this encounter between Reuben Blum, who is this child of immigrants born in the Bronx, but who wants to kind of escape from it, and he ends up being asked to be on the hiring committee of this college in Western New York, this tiny college where he's the only Jewish professor, and he's asked to be on this hiring committee really because he's the only other Jew on the faculty, really the other Jew in the school, and he has to deal with Ben-Zion Netanyahu, who at the time the book is set, 1959-1960, is just a jumble of syllables. Ben-Zion Netanyahu doesn't mean anything to anyone. The word Netanyahu doesn't mean anything to anyone. And so he begins, as you said, that night of staying up all night, but beyond that, he delves really deeply into this man's career. And Ben-Zion Netanyahu was he's born Milakovsky in Warsaw. His father's Natan Milakovsky, is a rabbi who is a sort of a peripheral Jabotinskyite, they wouldn't have called a revisionist back then, sort of a polemicist, but it's really his son, Ben-Zion, who, first of all, adopts the Netanyahu surname as one of his pseudonyms for writing for, I believe, Hayarden, one of the many right-wing PR articles he either edited and wrote for, or just wrote for. He's sort of a fatherless guy, right, who grows up in Jerusalem as one of the early classes within the first 5-6 years of Hebrew University. And I guess, what we would say in America is, what would we say? The immigrants are taking all our jobs. That's what we would say, right? And Ben-Zion Netanyahu was saying the same thing, except when he says the immigrants are taking all of its jobs, he means the European refugees. Because every year, he's at Hebrew University, more and more professors of history, and not just of history, are streaming in from European universities. And and it's unclear what really happens first, whether he feels like he can't measure up to, or whether he feels discriminated against as a largely Palestine-educated academic, or whether his politics kind of led his opposition. But he decides, while he's still a student, that his greatest enemy is the university, which is, always a good idea. He masterminds sort of a light terrorist incident by setting off a stink bomb during a lecture by Bentwich, who was from the Jewish Agency at the time, and essentially gets himself kicked out of the university, and finds himself at Dropsy College in Philadelphia, which was the earliest, was the first, I think, rabbinic seminary or institution for higher learning.
Institution for Jewish learning. Yeah.
In America now, it's, I guess, part of University of Pennsylvania. And he really dedicates his life to studying the Inquisition, and this is a fairly, this is like a sub-Wikipedia summary of his work, but his magnum opus is about 1,500 pages long. It's the origins of the Inquisition in 15th century Spain. But essentially, by writing about 1492, which is the expulsion of Jews from Spain, he was really writing about 1942, and he was really trying to kind of chart this eternal and recapitulative persecution of Jews, of Jewry, on a racial basis as a justification for the state of Israel. He had a double career in academia and really as some sort of a secretary or as a propagandist for Jabotinsky himself. But after Jabotinsky died, he gave himself over to academia. He taught a little bit at the University of Denver. Interestingly, was at the University of Denver at the same time as Al-Khattab, who was one of the intellectual leaders later of Daesh. So of ISIS, who wrote for who then went to Greeley Teachers College and wrote editorials about how women's skirts were too short in Colorado. But then he went to Cornell, where he ended up teaching until Yoni's death, and not a bad fiction writer. I'll let you judge if he's a good historian or not, but he's not a bad fiction writer.
So thank you, and also for the little bit of summary of the book that we got. I was struck by how much I couldn't stand any of the characters in the book. And I'm curious if you can tell us, as a writer, dealing with a real person who was probably not that likable in his real life, what was it like to live in your apartment with these characters and nobody else?
Well, I like unlikable people. You know, like I see, that's the thing. I'm sympathetic to Benzion Netanyahu, but not because I would rather that he that his middle child didn't become who he became, but I think that the idea of his frustration, the idea of he thought he was going to have a place in Israel, in the Israeli government. During the most determinative decades of, I would say, all Jewish history, right? The 30s to the 50s. He's not in Europe being slaughtered. And for a lot of that time, he's not in Palestine and Israel building a state. He's in Long Island, he's on the Upper West Side, and then he's in suburban Philadelphia, he's in Cheltenham. So this is a person who feels excluded from history. All of the revisionists, the Jabotinsky, were excluded from those early governments. They didn't even let Jabotinsky's body be buried in Israel. And so this is a person who is just, his entire life is this hothouse of resentment. And any writer can sympathize with that. That is the position of the writer. He sits and he counts his enemies, And the lesson is that, you shouldn't transmit that to your children because one day the return of the repressed, right? They might come back and become the ruler of the country that excluded you. It's almost like a folktale or a fable, right? A man is exiled from a kingdom, his son comes back and becomes the king, right? And but Benzion himself, in a vacuum, I find to be a degree sympathetic, and also, you guys tell me, I don't want to psychologize academia too much. This is an academic book, but, I always thought the problem with academia was that this is a place where the problem, right, is if there's one, right, is, the problem with academia was that, you went into this thing because all of the rest of the world was stupid, and you believed in ideas, and you wanted to talk about ideas and things that interested you, and you weren't going to go get a job at a toll booth or something, right? So you have this idea that you're like, I want to live the life of the mind, right? And then you get there, and you realize that you're actually a terrorist. And that's what Benzion Netanyahu was. He was not a person whose interest in the subject shut off at 6 o'clock. He's not a person whose interest in the subject ended with happy hour. He's not someone who would sit on a committee and review someone's something. He's someone who so believed in his subject that he thought it should be killed for. And there is there's something in someone who takes an attraction to its logical but heinous extreme that I find interesting to play out on the page.
So you're reminding me, I had a fellowship at one point from a foundation, and the head of the foundation, gathered a bunch of us who had this fellowship and said, it's so wonderful. We get to give people money to follow their obsessions, right? And in that way, perhaps academics and novelists have something in common. But I just want to point out, because you did a flip with Benzion, like the way he appears to me as an academic is somebody who's obsessed with the history of the hatred of the Jews. But to turn that into the way you just described him, he's somebody who's obsessed with the survival of the Jews, perhaps, or with the Jewish potential for revenge. And that's maybe the step that most of us academics don't necessarily make.
Maybe, but I kind of think it's the mistake that, I don't know, a lot of people I know make, which is, was he obsessed with the suffering of the Jews and their ultimate redemption, or was he obsessed with his own suffering and his own ultimate redemption? In a way, he's just a series of misreadings. He misreads a patternization of persecution that runs, Amalek, right? But in the scope of his book, it runs from, the Spanish Inquisition to the Holocaust. But there's also the sense in this book that when he's writing about, pogroms in the Middle Ages, he's not just writing about the Holocaust. He's such an insane person. He's writing about his own personal problems and how he's been persecuted and how, Ben-Gurion did this to him and Weizmann said this to him. And this is a person who confused all persecutions and took everything personally. And that's what makes him, a good character for a novel. I mean, not someone I would want to be in class with, not someone maybe I'd want to hang out with for more than a day just to see what's what, but I do think that confusion of world pain and personal pain is something that's familiar to me, at least.
Go ahead.
So no, I think it's interesting that we've been talking about, or I've been hearing you talk about psychologizing, but really from two different vantage points, right? On the one hand, there's Ben-Zion Netanyahu and his personal travails getting mapped onto, the travails of the Jewish people or vice versa.
Because he's the only person who could save the Jewish people, just like his son was the only person.
And that's exactly the second piece of psychologizing, right? Which is seeing the policy choices or the career trajectory of Bibi Netanyahu as it may have played out in response to or under the guidance of, his father's own history. There's just an anecdote here that we talked about earlier, but I think is so striking. When Benjamin Netanyahu met Pope Francis for the first time at the Vatican, he had a 20-minute private audience, and the gift he brought to the Pope the first time he met him as the representative of the State of Israel was a copy of his father's 1,500-page book about Christians hating Jews and the sort of, ineradicable nature of anti-Semitism. So I think that confirms much of the psychology, it's at least a piece of data that might point in the direction of an accurate diagnosis there. I wanted to ask you, though, about something...
You think he read it? You think the Pope, what did he just... he hands it to someone, right? And then they just have to... They write, a thank you note later?
I assume he must have blocked out the next 3 weeks just to sit there poring over. It's a tough read. It's interesting, though, that...
It's actually... I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
It's actually really funny because it almost proves that Bibi never read his father's book. Because the Iberian Inquisitions, and this is the whole point that Ben-Zion makes, they were the first regnal inquisitions. They were the inquisitions by a king, right? And as opposed to the papal inquisitions. And this was sort of, in Ben-Zion Netanyahu's thesis, this was proof that, not only was the racialization of Jewry used as a political lever, but it was just pervasive. It wasn't just the church that hated Jews, it was everyone. So I'd be interested if... I don't think Bibi read it.
I mean, he's been pretty busy, with other things.
Yeah.
And we probably shouldn't try to make a list of all the people who've read the book.
Right.
Although we could.
It might be a short list.
It might be the two of you.
It's interesting, though, because, we talk in academia sometimes about me-search, right? The things that people get interested in are not accidental or not coincidental to the things they're committed to, and Ben-Zion Netanyahu seems like an obvious example of that. It's still an open question, though, or I wonder, let me ask you, is it still an open question how wrong Ben-Zion Netanyahu was in his diagnosis of the nature of anti-Semitism? My sense is that in the study of anti-Semitism in academic contexts, it's still very much debated how much continuities we see, how much, we need to look only at discrete historical vignettes disconnected from one another. I wonder what you make of the argument, the Ben-Zion Netanyahu argument, or maybe a more attenuated version of the argument, that there is a through line here and something continuous and something threatening.
Well, I mean, I feel like it's like the role of, one Cohen to quote another, right? So the Cohen brothers, when he says, you're not wrong, you're just an asshole. It's just, I don't think he was wrong. I just think he was an asshole. From my own perspective, I don't know. I'm not trained in this. The only education that I received Jewishly was a religious education, which tells me that, yes, in every generation arises an Amalek. I mean, like, and
This is the time of year for...
Right, exactly. And so that I never had a formal history education beyond that. No one's tried to kill me, seriously, yet. So I think, from my perspective, I was mostly interested in stating the terms of that argument. But I was trying to state the terms there because there's another figure here that I kind of want to bring in, which is the figure that Ruben Blum is based on, who's Harold Bloom, who I never met Benzion Netanyahu. I met a lot of people who met him. They all said he was an asshole, But I spent a lot of time with Harold Bloom before he died. He died about a year before COVID. I was kind of desultorily working with him on maybe putting together a memoir that it became pretty clear, because he was ill, that was not going to get written. And Harold is interesting. He's an interesting figure for many ways, but he's a very strange figure for being most famous for his best idea. And most people aren't most famous for their best idea. Most people aren't most famous for their best book, for their best album, for their best whatever. But the influence theory, which people know from his book, The Anxiety of Influence, which is, I think, given short shrift by saying it's a importation of psychoanalysis into literary criticism, I think is most interesting about when it's applied to what one consciously or unconsciously avoids from the past. Harold's theory can be inexpertly summarized as someone who wants to become a writer, comes of age, and begins learning about how enormous the past is behind them, and how great the past was, and all of these master works by all of these geniuses. And it creates an enormous amount of anxiety. What do I have to add to this? What can I add to this? And because of that anxiety, there is usually unconscious or half-conscious misreading of the past, in which the past becomes wrong, and the only thing that can correct the past is the person's writing in the present. And I think that I wanted to bring that element of Harold's theory into the book. In a way, that's Benzion Netanyahu. He is unconsciously, misreading the past in order to make room for himself within the story.
Another way of understanding Harold Bloom is that we're always too late.
Yeah.
Right, that we're never on time to actually create anything new. And ultimately, what was first is God, and everything after that is late. We can't be gods, is sort of one way of summing it up. I want to ask you what about the Harold Bloom character keeps up that idea? Where in Rube Blum do we get Harold Bloom's sense of anxiety, of influence, of being too late, of never being able to catch up, of never quite doing what one wants to do?
Yeah, at the risk of putting myself on the couch, I think that's just all over the book with me. That's why you write a book with all of these tropes from the 1950s and 60s and try to understand what elements of the American novel sort of were Judaized or Yiddishized in some way. I think that element of that anxiety is just inherent in everything I do. I think it's an interesting description of my own relationship to a canon that disappeared as quickly as it emerged, right? And look, I couldn't write Harold because I knew him, because he was completely insane. Just completely insane. And if I wrote down really what he was like, people, it would just, no one would believe it. It was that kind of thing. And he was very much a freak. I mean, I met him, and he did that party trick of reciting 5 or 6 pages of a book of mine to me from memory. And he was in his 80s when he did that. He had that absolutely eidetic photographic memory. I mean, it was amazing. And so I knew that I couldn't, right? The book didn't have room for these two kind of figures. And I didn't want to write the Harold figure because the Harold figure is just so exceptional as to be, he's already fictional in reality, right? But when I was thinking, what do I do with this guy who's kind of Harold, I was like, maybe what I do is make him a professor of history and make him a professor of the history of taxation. Right? Taxation. He's a history of, I don't even know if that's a thing. Maybe someone teaches.
We probably call it economic history.
Yeah, but I like he's a professor of taxation studies. And I liked it because it was it obviously has resonance with a lot of the Hofjude or Jude del Corte, like the court Jew, tax farming profession of the Middle Ages, of the Jew who, the vizier who looks after the nobleman's money. And that had a connection to Benzion's, world. But he's a professor of American taxation studies, and I liked the idea of, what do we owe? What is owed? What is our debt? And specifically, that basic question that, I don't know about you, but I ask this time of year, of like, why am I paying this money so these people that I don't like, that I live on a street with, who I think are shitheads and don't do anything interesting with their lives, so that they can have a road? It's like, it's literally, what do I owe the people around me and why? What do I owe this system in which I live? And I think that element of debt is a huge part of that influence theory too, because there's a sense of saying, what do I owe the past? To what standard do I need to aspire?
Can you talk a little bit about that moment in the 20th century that you were just describing? You said the moment that came and that left too quickly, it created a canon. Can you develop that?
Yeah, I don't know. I'm trying to in life.
No, but the idea of it.
I'm doing it every day. No, it's I think that Jews came to the American novel pretty close to the end of the novel. I think if I'm being really reductive about it or being quick about it, it's like Munger thing about, why can't, he wrote that essay, why can't Jews write novels? But the real essay is like, why can't it's like Munger write a novel? And, he goes through a number of questions, or a number of answers, sorry, here. One is, he says, Jews can't write novels because the novel is a creation of a 19th century nation state. To read Victor Hugo is to read France, to read Tolstoy is to read Russia, but Jews have never had a country, and there's also not one standard form of Yiddish, there's not one, so there's no national representation in it. Okay, so that's answer one. Then he goes to answer two, and answer two he says, novels believe in change, and Jews don't believe in change, because change is to betray the tradition, or change is to betray yourself, and okay. And increasingly this essay seems crazy, but he ends up by saying, well, that's why, Yiddish literature is the literature of the anecdote, is the literature of the, of Agadah, of a little story, of the parable, and the joke, and I think that the reason why I'm bringing that up is because I think that in many ways, all of the concerns of the 20th century novel were things that were already realized in Jewish, I'm not going to call it pilpul, in Jewish text, in the relationship of Jews to their texts. Metafictionality, the idea that Torah, is the book that describes its own giving. the thing is given in the middle of the book, you know, metatextuality, intertextuality, blah, 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 blah. All of this stuff is in the tradition, storytelling. And when the storytelling impulse in America becomes grafted onto the novelistic form, all it does is rediscover the same devices of the past. And I think that you don't get much joy or much time out of rediscovery. And I think that, like, in speaking from a very large historical spectrum, you know, there's not much that one is going to find by following the novel that one can't find by going into the past in that sort of textuality.
So the American Jewish novel becomes another symptom of assimilation and distance from the Jewish tradition?
I think so. I mean, but I don't think it's just the American Jewish novel. I mean, I think that the American Jewish novel is, at least, it has English, which is, you know, English is like, you know, when you, I don't know, everyone here is probably cleaner than me, but like when you keep the sink sponge too long,
yeah,
it just, you know, that old sponge, it just soaks up everything. So at least English has this, but I mean, you know, look at what's happened to the Hebrew language novel, right? Where, you know, we're finally now at the end. Finally, I mean, it's not like I was waiting for it, but, you know, there was this projection of the Russian novel and the European novel into the Hebrew language novel. And now that Oz is gone and Grossman's older and Yoshua declares every week in Haaretz that he's dying, you know, but hasn't yet, you know, you have this necessity to reinvent what prose is in Hebrew. Like, I think that it isn't just the American Jewish novel, it's not just Jews writing novels. I think that the extended prose narrative has a lot of problems these days. One is its truth value, one is people's impatience with metaphoric reading. You know, everyone's question with this book, and thank you for not asking it yet, has been like, what's true in it and what's not, you know? And the idea that you have to stop and explain to someone that, well, maybe something should be read metaphorically, maybe something should be read analogically. The idea that, like, that needs to be explained these days is an indication that the novel is not in favor.
Dave, I'll let you go in 1 second, but I just have to tell you that when I was listening to you read your nonfiction, I found myself thinking, did his brother really send that email? Was the attachment actually that number of words long? But, you know, when somebody plays with genre,
sure,
then all of a sudden we play with it everywhere.
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, I also feel that every writer these days is sort of like, you know, like the spouse who used to cheat and now you're in couples therapy and it's like, prove everything. Like, you know, let me read your email. Like, there's such an incredible need to define these boundaries when I don't really feel that, I just know that people crave those boundaries because they don't have them. So what we need to do is all admit to each other we don't have them and stop demanding them of others when we can't sustain them ourselves.
So I'm not going to ask you which parts of the novel are true or false, now that you've requested that I not. I will point out to the audience that there's a really mind-bending afterword to the book that takes on this question in a really interesting...
Oh, that's totally true. That's totally true.
And I do want to make sure that we're going to leave time for audience Q&A, so maybe if you'll permit me one more question before we turn it over. You know, you mentioned just at the outset that you never thought you'd write a campus novel about a Jewish historian of a certain sort. Here we are in a Jewish Studies Center sponsored event on a university campus. I know that you teach within a Jewish Studies context partially at a university as well, at Columbia. How much resemblance is there between the modern university, do you think, and the university you describe in the book in terms of the conflict, maybe we'd say particularly as it pertains to the Jewish characters, or maybe more broadly in terms of sort of a classical liberal idea that everybody can sublimate their personal identity and just be a part of a sort of a religiously neutral public sphere versus a kind of an identity politics, presumption that there are certain things or group identities that, that need to be celebrated and to be maintained. I wonder what Ruben Blum would make of Northwestern in 2022, or if you have any thoughts about that.
Well, I mean, I think he'd be pretty comfortable here until someone probably called him out on an element of his behavior that he was completely unaware of, and then he would probably lose his job. But no, I don't know. I mean, I think that one of the things that maybe I can say something about Harold Bloom, right? In this way, of who certainly has his problems, or had his problems. The truth is, though, is that I can't imagine, maybe someone like not teaching something or writing something if I didn't love it, right? If I didn't believe in it entirely. And almost if I didn't believe in its capacity to explain the world. And that becomes very difficult to then deal with it in like a Wissenschaft kind of way. You to dedicate your life to something, to see it as the prism or even the microcosm of all existence, how do you become liberal again after that? And I think that as long as that tension is acknowledged, one can always gauge where one wanders. I mean, one of the texts that really underlies this book, and is in a way a joke on Netanyahu, on Benjamin Netanyahu, is Yerushalmi, right? And I think that was one of the things that he wrestled with his entire life. And certainly his encounter with his own biases, which also were which he called his soul. It's interesting.
I think with that, we should turn it over to the audience for Q&A, and I already see some hands going up.
So Nancy in the back has a microphone.
So we'll bring the microphone around, and we'll go one at a time.
Hello? Okay. In the 60s, I graduated from Stuyvesant High School and CCNY. I had 2 surgeries on my nose so I could commiserate with Judy's black eyes. And I taught 15 years at a community college with a very similar cast of weird characters. When I think about Netanyahu and his sort of confusion of the present and the past, and his role in it, my question to you is, could Israel have been created if there weren't hundreds of brilliant, sometimes misguided men and women with that intense historical perspective confused with their own present, state of mind, that were willing to, work at it and be driven by it, some successfully, in Netanyahu's case, not politically successfully, but wasn't that the power that drove the foundation of the state?
I mean, yeah, first of all, I want to say you look great. But, yeah, I mean, I think, it's one of these, absolutely, I think it's the case. And in fact, I think it's the other way around. Like when people talk about an existential war, right? Israel fighting a war for its existence, right? Which were its wars up in through the 80s. When people talk about the sense of threat and precarity of the early state. It's just a polite way of saying that almost everyone in there is traumatized and was fighting for their lives, right? I mean, the state just becomes the externalization of the individual. And every individual there knew that if they didn't throw down, they didn't have anything. And I think that, you know, in many ways, we have a lot of polite, euphemistic ways to talk about wars of existence. And, but these were people who fought these individual wars for existence way before they landed in Palestine.
I'm very sympathetic with the person who comes to Dropsy College to teach, because in 1992, when I came for the first time in this country, I came to Dropsy College to give a lecture, and the president of the Dropsy College told me, "Yohanan, don't even think about coming to teach here." So, and I like the campus, but my question is different. I'm looking at the jacket of your book, and I see the car lost or stuck in the snow amid the trees, and I would like you to tell us something about how you were thinking about the jacket, and what is the correlation between the what is after the jacket and what is on the jacket. Okay, that's my first question.
Okay.
And my second question is very simple. In addition to some other things, once in a while I teach a course on the image of the Jew in European modernism. And I have no problem with choosing short stories, Jewish, non-Jewish, to teach what I teach. But I always have a problem with a novel. So I would like to ask you, a very egotistic question. If I have, let's say, a seminar, and I have to teach one Jewish novel of the, let's say, well, late 19th, 20th century, what would be this one novel that I can take that would not be really rediscovery, that would not be, coming back to yourself or rediscovering your own roots, that you would want to teach as one novel that you can teach in course of this course? Thank you.
One novel, okay. It's probably a bad answer. But I would say Family Mashber, der Nister. It's long, but it has everything in it. I mean, it has, it has all the parts that maybe hang together and maybe don't, but and it's funny. Yeah.
Can you repeat the title? I think there's some people who didn't hear
Family Mashber by der Nister.
We don't have it for sale, unfortunately, but you can order it on Amazon.
Yeah. The jacket, there's a funny, I'll try and tell a story about the jacket. So I don't know if people know, I feel like they're shining the jacket directly in my eye the way they have this done. So if I'm not looking at you, it's because of that. There were a bunch of home movies of Netanyahu that Benzion Netanyahu made, actually, particularly when he went to Niagara Falls, which was like a popular place that he took visitors who were visiting him from Israel over the years. And so there were a number of like Super 8 movies and little stills kind of around, and some of them we were able to use. But where are they? Interesting. So, I don't know if people know, the building this new, the National Library has been around for a very long time, but they're building a new facility, the National Library in Jerusalem, right deep into this hill. And I went on a tour of it. I can't remember when, because all time is blurred, but sometime before 3 years ago, but yeah, maybe 5 years ago. It was a very Israeli tour in the sense of, you kind of go down into the side of this hill, and someone says, and I'm going to get this wrong because when people say the word nuclear bomb, I just tend to tune out. But they say, there's going to be this kind of, lined safe down here or whatever, and it can withstand like a 60-ton, megaton nuclear blast. So it's like, great. I'm glad. And, and I think they have, they pick like, 100 works to reside in this, Kadosh Kadoshim of the, whatever this is, of like this hill side of the safe of the National Library. And they have 100 of them, and it's like, we have Rambam, and we have Kafka, and we have this, and we have that. And the 100th work is Ben-Zion Netanyahu's manuscripts. Yeah. It's just like, they had a committee, they put together, they're like, we're going to do Shai Agnon, we're going to have this, we're going to have this, we're going to have this. And then it's like, and it's everything from like the beginning of time to like, it's like the Aleppo Codex and this and this and this, and this is number 100. And that was amazing. It was just like, it was perfect, right? And I was like, well, what's going to go in here? And it's a pile of, I think it's a copy of his dissertation on Bravanel and his Morano book, but like, and some correspondence. And then, so they took all of the writings, like the typescripts, and they moved it to like that side, and they separated it from all of the home movies. And so I had access to the home movies. So, like in the collection, they basically partitioned off this stuff, and in the Ben-Zion Netanyahu collection, there were still just these like Super 8 movies that were around.
For a second, I was sure you were going to say that the videos of Niagara Falls were in the archive as the 100th item.
Right, exactly.
Thank God. Okay.
No. Instead, it's like bad carbon copies of like his third draft of his book about the Anusim.
Amazing.
Yeah. Wow.
So what does that have to do with the cover?
That's where I got the image. It's from a Super 8 still.
Oh, so it's an actual image from...
It's an image from, actually not a Super 8, it's a slide, when they turn things into slides.
Amazing.
Yeah.
So there's, not to tell you your own book, but for those, right, there is a scene early in the book when he arrives and the car gets stuck in the snow.
Yeah.
And I did not put together that this was an actual...
I don't think he's stuck in the snow, I just think he's kind of, he's in the snow. I mean, it's not hard to find a picture of Ithaca, New York in the snow.
Amazing.
Yeah. I think is that a Ford Galaxy? I used to know what that was. I think it's a Fairlane or Galaxy. Someone knows, I don't know.
Any other questions?
So Philip Roth talked about Saul Bellow and the Adventures of Augie March, like opening up his eyes to a new way to write about the American Jewish experience. And I'm wondering if any particular person or thing had an influence on the way you wrote about the American Jewish experience or reflected on it.
Not really. I don't know. My mom, maybe. I don't know. I mean, I think for me, it was a much more maybe globalized, for lack of a better word, eye-opening. I worked as a journalist and lived for many years abroad in Czech Republic, in Germany, a little bit in Ukraine, in Israel. I feel like I was able to live, I was lucky to live like a far more international life than my parents. I think it was being exposed to writers of those cultures that opened me up. I mean, I think when Roth had that Penguin series, right? The Writers from Other Europe, where he was publishing Bruno Schultz, he was publishing Danilo Kish, he was publishing many writers, Gary Conrad, many writers from at that time from Eastern Bloc. I think that it was one thing to read those writers, sometimes in those editions, and it was another thing to kind of live in that part of the world and work in that part of the world. And I think that for me was, a much more, it was a really determinative experience. I mean, when I look at someone I looked at some of Benzion Netanyahu's travel records, right? And this guy he's taking a boat to get to the United States. I know that for my parents, when my father went and was living in Israel and kibbutz for years, and it was like, I know that my grandparents who were immigrants to the States treated it as if he was dead. He was going so far away, and I don't know any other, when in the history of the Jewish people, right, could you live a life like mine, where I would just go to Israel 3 times a year on a flight that sometimes was pretty cheap, where I lived in many countries of Eastern Europe and traveled freely among them. And I enjoyed the fact that it was a 2-hour flight from anywhere, Berlin east to Tel Aviv. That shrinking of the world and the absolute mind-boggling shrinking of the world was probably the most determinative thing in my work.
I think we probably have time for one more question if anybody has one. There's a question in the back.
I sat in the back because I thought I wasn't going to ask a question, but very selfishly, as somebody who grew up in a small Western New York town, remarkably similar to this one you created, why was this the setting? How did you end up with Corbin University? Why not go with Ithaca? Why did it have to be Western New York?
Sorry. I didn't want to do Ithaca because I didn't want to say the name. Also, the real life encounter between Harold and Benzion. I love these reviews that show up somewhere and they're like, Josh Cohen made all of this up because this didn't happen then. It's like, everyone assumed that encounter between Harold Bloom and Benzion Netanyahu happened at Cornell. It didn't happen at Yale. I didn't want to, because of course Yale is the only place they're going to tell this guy, you're a Jew, go bring him around. And the truth is that I didn't want to write about New Haven, because New Haven's boring. I mean, I don't know, New Haven's a city. It looks like what the cities I grew up, I didn't want to write about New Haven. And so I didn't want to use any real university's name. So I didn't want to use any real university's town. I was, oh man, I'm trying to remember. It's in the book that the name of the, weirdly, Ido Netanyahu worked as a radiologist in a town in Western New York, pretty close to where I have set my Corbindale. Worked as a radiologist there for actually a couple decades before he became the celebrated playwright with productions in Azerbaijan, courtesy of his brother, that he currently is. And I think also, I was thinking a lot about, I don't know, I was thinking a lot about my friends, frankly, who, they had kids, they still have kids are not dead yet. They have kids who are living in tiny New York apartments, and suddenly in the periods of 2 years, all my friends were upstate. And upstate, for someone who doesn't know upstate, can mean anything from Chautauqua County all the way in the west to Buffalo, right? And so all of my friends were leaving me. And so I was just like, oh, I'm gonna imagine where my friends are. So anytime I'm making fun of the city, I'm just making fun of my friends for moving there.
I think I probably speak for everybody in the room when I say that this has been tremendously enlightening and thought-provoking and really just fun. So Joshua, thank you so much for being here with us. Let me make two logistical announcements. The first is that we will have some books available for sale and a small reception set up outside. Joshua has very graciously agreed to stick around and chat and sign some books. And the second logistical announcement is that next month we'll be having our annual Klutznick Lecture, which we hold every year in partnership with the Jewish Federation of Chicago. It's going to feature Laura Liebman of Reed College speaking about a multiracial Jewish family in early America. It's going to be fascinating, and you are all warmly welcome to join us again for that next month. In the meantime, for those who are celebrating, joyous Pesach holiday, and be well, everyone. Thanks so much.